I only need you to pretend for one night. After that, I will disappear from your life forever." Sophia Bennett never expected those words to bring the most unexpected person into her world. The night she whispered that request, she was not looking for romance. She was not searching for a perfect ending. She was simply a mother trying to protect the only thing that mattered most: her son, Ethan. The rain tapped softly against the windows of the small apartment where Sophia sat at the kitchen table, looking at a letter she wished she never had to read. The room was quiet except for the sound of Ethan sleeping in the next room. On the table were documents, bills, and a reminder of a problem she could no longer avoid. For years, Sophia had handled everything alone. She worked long hours at a small hotel. She managed every expense carefully. She learned how to smile even on the hardest days because Ethan deserved to see hope, not worry. At 29 years old, she had become an expert at carrying responsibilities no one else saw. But tonight was different. Tomorrow was the one event she could not face alone. A family gathering where everyone would ask questions she did not want to answer. Questions about why she was raising Ethan alone. Questions about the father who was no longer part of their lives. Questions that would remind her of everything she had lost. Sophia looked at the small photo of Ethan on the table. He was smiling brightly, unaware of the difficult choices his mother was making. She touched the photo gently and whispered, "I will figure this out." She always did. But this time, she needed a solution. Not for herself, for her son. Across the city, inside a glass office high above downtown, Alexander Reed was finishing another long day. At 40 years old, he was the CEO of Reed International. People knew him as a brilliant businessman, a man who built an empire through discipline, intelligence, and determination. His schedule was filled with meetings, investments, and decisions worth millions of dollars. But behind the success was a quiet loneliness he rarely admitted. Alexander had everything people dreamed of having, except someone waiting for him when he returned home. His phone rang late that evening. He almost ignored it. Almost. But something made him answer. "Mr. Reed," a familiar voice said. Alexander recognized the person immediately. Someone connected to his family. Someone calling about a situation he never expected. "There is a request that requires your attention." Alexander looked out at the city lights. What kind of request? He listened carefully. And then he heard a name. Sophia Bennett. The name meant nothing to him at first. A stranger. Someone from a completely different world. But the reason behind the request caught his attention. A mother. A child. A difficult situation. Meanwhile, Sophia sat in her apartment, staring at a contact number she never thought she would use. She knew who Alexander Reed was. Everyone did. A billionaire CEO. A man whose world was completely different from hers. She had no reason to believe he would help. No reason to believe he would even listen. But when Ethan's future was involved, Sophia was willing to do something she hated. Ask for help. The next morning, she walked into the headquarters of Reed International wearing her simplest professional outfit. She felt out of place among the expensive suits and polished floors. But she kept walking. She was not there because of money. She was not there because of status. She was there because she needed someone to play a role for one night. When Alexander Reed finally met her, he expected a complicated business request. Instead, he saw a woman standing in front of him with courage in her eyes and a reason bigger than herself. "Can you pretend to be my husband?" Sophia whispered. The question surprised him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Alexander looked at the woman asking for something completely unexpected. Sophia looked at the billionaire who represented a world she never belonged to. Neither of them knew it yet, but that simple request was about to change both of their lives. Because sometimes the person who agrees to pretend to be part of your family becomes the person who teaches you what family truly means. Alexander Reed had heard many unusual requests throughout his career. As a billionaire CEO, people often came to him with complicated problems, business challenges, investment opportunities, difficult negotiations. But never before had someone looked him in the eyes and asked him to pretend to be her husband. For a moment, the room inside Reed International felt completely silent. Sophia Bennett stood in front of his desk, holding herself together with a strength Alexander immediately noticed. She was nervous. He could see that. But she was not weak. She was a mother who had reached a point where protecting her son mattered more than protecting her pride. "I know this sounds strange," Sophia said quietly. "I would not be asking if I had another choice." Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. Most people who entered his office wanted something from him because of his money. They wanted connections, opportunities, influence. Sophia was different. She was asking for help, but she looked like she would rather carry the entire world alone than ask someone else to hold even a small part of it. Why me? Alexander finally asked. Sophia took a breath. Because I need someone people will respect. Someone who can make them believe I am not alone. Her answer made him curious. Who are these people? She looked down for a moment. My former in-laws. They are holding an important family event, and they believe they have the right to make decisions about Ethan's future. Alexander noticed the change in her expression when she mentioned her son. It was not fear. It was determination. You are worried about your child. Sophia nodded. I will do anything to protect him. Alexander looked at the documents on his desk. Then he looked back at her. He had built his career by understanding people, reading situations, finding the hidden reason behind every decision. And right now, he saw something clear. Sophia was not looking for a wealthy husband. She was looking for a shield. Someone who could stand beside her for one night. And what exactly are you asking me to do? He asked. Sophia hesitated. Pretend to be my husband. Alexander almost smiled at the simplicity of the request. For how long? One evening. She paused. That is all. One evening. A few hours. A simple arrangement. At least, that was what it sounded like. Alexander stood and walked toward the window. Below him, the city continued moving. People rushing through their own stories. He thought about his own life. A schedule filled with responsibilities. A home that was always quiet. A world where everyone knew his name, but very few people knew him. What is in this for you? Sophia asked carefully. Alexander looked back. What do you mean? People like you do not usually agree to things without a reason. Her honesty surprised him. She was not trying to flatter him. She was simply stating the truth. You are right, Alexander said. I usually do not. Sophia lowered her eyes. Then why are you considering it? He did not have an immediate answer. That bothered him more than he expected, because something about her situation felt different. Maybe it was the way she spoke about Ethan. Maybe it was the way she stood there trying to protect her family without asking for anything beyond what she needed. Finally, Alexander said, I will help you. Sophia looked up in surprise. Really? He nodded. But there will be rules. She listened carefully. This is an arrangement. Nothing more. Sophia nodded quickly. I understand. No misunderstandings. No expectations. We play the roles we need to play, and when it is over, we go back to our separate lives. Sophia agreed. The words were simple, clear, safe. Exactly what they both needed. The next day, Alexander and Sophia began preparing for the event. His team arranged the details. Her instructions were simple. How they met. How long they had supposedly been together. The small details needed to make the story believable. But the more Alexander learned about Sophia's life, the more he noticed something unusual. She never complained. Not about the challenges. Not about raising Ethan alone. Not about the difficult choices she had made. She simply kept going. That was something Alexander understood. He had built his empire the same way. Through determination. Through sacrifice. But he had never considered how much strength it took to raise a child while carrying everything alone. On the evening before the event, Alexander met Ethan for the first time. The little boy looked at him with curiosity. Are you Mom's friend? He asked. Alexander smiled. Yes. Ethan thought for a moment. Are you nice? The question caught Alexander off guard. Adults usually asked about his company or his success. A child only cared about one thing. His character. I try to be, Alexander answered. Ethan smiled. That is good. And in that small moment, Alexander realized something unexpected. The arrangement was supposed to be about pretending. But somehow, the most honest part of the entire situation had already begun. The agreement between Sophia Bennett and Alexander Reed was supposed to be simple. One evening, one appearance, one story they would both pretend to believe until it was over. That was the plan. But plans often looked different once real people became part of them. The day before the event, Sophia sat across from Alexander in a quiet conference room at Reed International. Between them was a document outlining the arrangement. Every detail was written clearly. The timeline, the expectations, the boundaries. This is just temporary, Alexander said. Sophia nodded. I know. He looked at her carefully. And when it ends, we both return to our normal lives. Sophia gave a small smile. That was always the plan. Alexander noticed something about her response. She was not dreaming about a different life. She was not trying to use this situation to escape her problems. She simply wanted one chance to protect her son. That made him respect her. Most people who entered his world wanted access to his success. Sophia only wanted someone to stand beside her for a few hours. Later that afternoon, Alexander's team prepared everything for the event. His staff arranged the details needed to make their story believable. They needed to know how they met, how long they had been together. Small details that made a simple story feel real. Sophia listened carefully, but she also looked uncomfortable. Alexander noticed. "Are you having second thoughts?" he asked. She looked down. "No," she paused. "I just never imagined I would need to do something like this." Alexander understood more than she expected. "You mean pretending to be married?" Sophia shook her head. "No, needing someone to stand up for me." The honesty of her answer stayed with him. Alexander had spent years surrounded by powerful people. People who negotiated. People who demanded. People who protected their own interests. But Sophia was different. She was not looking for power. She was looking for support. That evening, Alexander visited Sophia's home to continue preparing for the event. It was the first time he saw her world. It was not large. It was not luxurious. But it was warm. There were drawings on the refrigerator. Small toys near the living room. Family photos showing moments that mattered. Ethan ran toward his mother when they entered. "Mom, you are home." Sophia smiled and hugged him. "Yes, sweetheart." Alexander watched quietly. He was used to expensive houses that felt empty. This place was completely different. It had less space, but more life. Ethan looked at Alexander with curiosity. "Are you coming with us tomorrow?" he asked. Sophia smiled gently. "Yes." The boy thought for a moment. "Are you Mom's friend?" Alexander answered carefully. "Yes." Ethan nodded. "Good. Mom needs good friends." The simple sentence surprised Alexander. He had heard thousands of complicated statements in business meetings. But a child's honesty carried something different. Later, after Ethan went to sleep, Alexander and Sophia sat in the kitchen discussing the final details. "He likes you," Sophia said. Alexander looked surprised. "He barely knows me." She smiled. Kids notice things adults ignore. Alexander looked toward the hallway where Ethan had disappeared. "He seems like a great kid." Sophia's expression softened. "He is." There was a quiet moment between them. Not romantic. Not yet. Just two people recognizing something important about each other. Alexander saw a mother who had built an entire life around protecting her child. Sophia saw a man who seemed cold from the outside, but was beginning to show kindness in small ways. The next evening, they arrived at the family event together. Sophia wore a simple, elegant dress. Alexander wore a tailored suit. From the outside, they looked exactly like the couple they were pretending to be. Guests welcomed them warmly. Questions came quickly. How did they meet? How long had they been married? How did Alexander balance work and family? Sophia and Alexander answered smoothly. They had practiced. They knew the story. But then someone asked about Ethan. "He seems very attached to you," a guest said to Alexander. For a moment, Alexander forgot the script. He looked at Ethan standing nearby. Then he answered honestly. "He is a wonderful kid." It was a simple response. But Sophia noticed something. Alexander was no longer pretending in that moment. He was simply being kind. And as the evening continued, both of them started realizing something unexpected. The hardest part of this arrangement was not convincing other people they were a family. It was slowly forgetting that, for a few moments, they were only pretending. The evening at the family event was supposed to be nothing more than a performance. Sophia Bennett and Alexander Reed had prepared the story. They knew what to say. They knew how to stand together. They knew how to convince everyone watching that they were a happy married couple. But what neither of them expected was how natural it would begin to feel. Alexander had spent years attending events where every conversation had a purpose. People approached him because of his company, his influence, or his reputation. But standing beside Sophia felt different. She was not impressed by his wealth. She was not trying to gain anything from him. She was simply grateful that he was there for Ethan. As the evening continued, Alexander noticed the smallest details about Sophia. The way she checked on Ethan without interrupting conversations. The way she smiled whenever her son looked happy. The way she thanked everyone who helped her, even for small things. He had seen many successful people in his life, but very few had her kind of strength. "You are good at this," Alexander said quietly as they stood together near the reception area. Sophia looked surprised. At pretending? He shook his head. At taking care of people. She looked away for a moment. I have had practice. Those words carried more meaning than she intended. Alexander understood that behind every calm expression was a story he did not know. Later, when they sat at the dinner table, several guests asked questions about their relationship. Sophia and Alexander answered carefully. They talked about how they met. They described their shared experiences. They played the roles they had agreed to play. But something unexpected happened. The more they talked, the less it felt like acting. When someone asked Alexander about Ethan, he answered without hesitation. He is an amazing kid. Sophia looked at him. The answer was simple, but she noticed something important. Alexander was not saying it because he had to. He meant it. After the event ended, they walked outside into the cool evening air. For the first time that night, they were away from everyone watching them. Thank you, Sophia said. Alexander looked at her. For what? For making it easier than I expected. He smiled slightly. I should probably thank you too. Sophia looked confused. Why? Because tonight reminded me that not every important thing in life happens inside a boardroom. The honesty of his words surprised her. Alexander Reed was known as a man who controlled every situation. But around Sophia and Ethan, he seemed less interested in controlling things and more interested in understanding them. The next morning, Sophia expected everything to return to normal. The event was over. The agreement was still temporary. She prepared herself to go back to her usual routine. But then Alexander called. How is Ethan? He asked. Sophia paused. She had expected him to ask about the arrangement, about the next steps. Instead, he asked about her son. He is good, she replied. He keeps talking about yesterday. Alexander smiled. Does he? Yes. He said you were nice. There was a quiet moment. Alexander looked out of his office window. He is a smart kid. Sophia smiled. He is. After the call ended, Alexander remained still for a moment. He could not explain why a simple conversation with a child stayed in his mind. He had spent his life surrounded by adults who cared about achievements and appearances. Ethan cared about something much simpler, whether someone was kind. Meanwhile, Sophia tried to understand the strange feeling she had after the event. She knew the arrangement was temporary. She knew Alexander was only helping her. But she also noticed something she did not expect. He had never once made her feel like a burden. He treated her with respect. He listened when she spoke. He noticed the things others ignored. That was rare. Over the next few days, their pretend marriage continued whenever they needed to appear together. But between those moments, something changed. Alexander started asking about Ethan's interests. Sophia started learning more about the man behind the CEO title. They were still following the rules of their agreement. No expectations. No emotions. No future promises. At least, that was what they told themselves. Because neither of them realized that the hardest part of pretending to be a family was not convincing other people. It was convincing themselves that they did not want it to become real. The arrangement between Sophia Bennett and Alexander Reed was supposed to have clear boundaries. They would appear together when necessary. They would answer questions with the same story. They would help each other through a difficult moment. Then everything would return to normal. At least, that was what they believed. But as the days passed, the line between pretending and reality became harder to see. Alexander noticed small things about Sophia that surprised him. She never complained about her situation. She never used her struggles as an excuse. Even when she was tired, her attention was always on Ethan. One afternoon, Alexander stopped by Sophia's home to bring documents related to the upcoming events where they needed to appear together. He expected a quick conversation. Instead, he found Sophia sitting at the kitchen table helping Ethan with a school project. The room was filled with simple things. Coloring pages, books, a small cup of juice beside Ethan's notebook. It was completely different from Alexander's quiet penthouse. Yet somehow, it felt warmer. You are early, Sophia said when she noticed him. Alexander smiled slightly. I finished my meetings sooner than expected. Ethan looked up. Are you staying for dinner? The question was innocent. Simple. But it caught Alexander off guard. He looked at Sophia, who immediately looked apologetic. Ethan, Mr. Reed is busy. Alexander shook his head. It is okay. He looked at Ethan. I can stay for a little while. That evening became something neither of them expected. There was no business discussion. No contract. No pretending. Just a simple meal with a mother and her son. Alexander listened as Ethan talked about school. He laughed at small jokes. He helped clean the table afterward. Sophia watched quietly. She had expected Alexander to be polite because of their agreement. She had not expected him to genuinely enjoy being there. "You are different around him," she said after Ethan went to his room. Alexander looked confused. "Different how?" "Softer." The word surprised him. Nobody had described him that way before. Alexander was known as disciplined, focused, serious. "Maybe he brings out a different side of me," he admitted. Sophia smiled. "Kids do that." The next day, Alexander returned to his office and found himself thinking about the previous evening. He had attended countless expensive dinners in his life, events with important people, rooms filled with influence and power. But a simple meal in Sophia's kitchen stayed in his mind longer than any of them. His assistant noticed his distraction. "Everything okay?" she asked. Alexander looked up. "Yes." She glanced at the schedule. "The family event preparation is taking a lot of your time." Alexander nodded. "It is." "Is the arrangement still just business?" The question caught him by surprise. He looked at the documents on his desk. The contract, the rules, the agreement that was supposed to keep everything simple. "Yes," he answered. But even he noticed the hesitation. Meanwhile, Sophia struggled with a different feeling. She appreciated Alexander's help, but she reminded herself constantly that this was temporary. She had seen people leave before. She knew better than to depend on someone who was only passing through her life. But Alexander was making that harder. He remembered Ethan's favorite snacks. He asked about his school activities. He checked in without being asked. Those were not actions from someone simply playing a role. One evening, Sophia found Alexander talking with Ethan in the living room. Ethan was showing him a drawing. "This is my family," the boy explained. Sophia stopped when she heard those words. Alexander looked at the picture. "That is a great drawing." Ethan pointed at the figures. "This is Mom. This is me. And this is you." For a moment, nobody spoke. Alexander looked at the drawing. Sophia looked at Alexander. It was just a child's imagination. Nothing more. But somehow, it carried a weight neither adult expected. Later that night, Alexander stood outside his car before leaving. He looked back at the small house where Sophia and Ethan lived. A place completely different from his world. A place where people cared about each other without needing a reason. He had entered Sophia's life because of a simple agreement. But now he found himself asking a question he never expected. What if the part he was pretending to play was the part he had always wanted? The more time Alexander Reed spent around Sophia Bennett and Ethan, the more difficult it became to remember that everything was supposed to be temporary. The agreement had rules. The arrangement had an ending. But real moments did not follow contracts. They appeared quietly and changed people before they even noticed. Alexander had spent most of his life believing emotions were distractions. As a CEO, he learned to make decisions quickly and logically. Every choice needed a reason. Every action needed a purpose. But Ethan did not care about any of those things. The little boy did not see a billionaire. He saw someone who listened, someone who showed up, someone who made him smile. One Saturday morning, Alexander arrived at Sophia's home with no business reason. He did not have an event to attend. He did not need to pretend. He simply wanted to spend time with them. Sophia opened the door and looked surprised. "You are here early." Alexander smiled. "I know." She looked at him curiously. "Is something wrong?" He shook his head. "No. I just thought Ethan might want to go to the park." Sophia paused. It was such a normal thing. A simple family activity. Yet coming from Alexander, it felt unexpected. "You do not have to do that," she said. Alexander looked at her. "I know." That answer stayed with her. Because for the first time, Alexander was doing something not because the agreement required it. He was doing it because he wanted to. At the park, Ethan ran happily across the grass while Alexander watched nearby. Sophia stood beside him. "You are good with him," she said. Alexander smiled. "I am learning." "You never thought about having children?" she asked. He looked toward Ethan. "I thought about it once." Sophia noticed the change in his expression. "What happened?" Alexander was quiet for a moment. "I spent so much time building my company that I convinced myself there would always be time for everything else." Sophia understood. She knew what it meant to postpone parts of yourself for responsibility. "And now?" she asked. Alexander watched Ethan laugh. "Now I think some moments do not wait." The answer touched her because she knew exactly what he meant. Later that afternoon, they returned home. Ethan fell asleep on the couch after an exciting day. Alexander carefully placed a blanket over him. Sophia watched from the doorway. There was something different about the scene. The man in front of her was not acting. He was not performing the role of a husband. He was simply being kind. "You are going to make this difficult," Sophia said quietly. Alexander turned toward her. "What do you mean?" She looked at Ethan. This was supposed to be temporary. Alexander understood. He looked away for a moment. "I know." Neither of them said what they were both thinking. The rules were becoming harder to follow. The next week, Alexander had another event where Sophia needed to appear with him. This time, something felt different. They no longer had to force their conversations. They laughed naturally. They understood each other's expressions. They moved like two people who had known each other much longer than they actually had. Several guests commented on how happy they seemed together. Sophia smiled politely, but inside, the words affected her, because a small part of her wondered what it would feel like if it were real. Alexander noticed too. He noticed how easily Sophia fit into his world. Not because she changed herself, because she brought something his world lacked: warmth. At the end of the evening, they stood outside beneath the city lights. "You know," Alexander said, "when we started this, I thought I was helping you." Sophia looked at him. "And now?" He smiled slightly. "Now I think I needed this too." The honesty between them created a quiet moment. Sophia looked away, reminding herself that this was not real. Alexander did the same. But both of them felt the same uncertainty growing. The arrangement that started as a simple favor was becoming something neither had planned. And the hardest part was no longer pretending to be a family in front of others. It was pretending they did not want to become one. The agreement between Sophia Bennett and Alexander Reed was becoming more complicated with every passing day. Not because the rules had changed. The contract was still clear. The arrangement was still temporary. But the feelings behind those rules were becoming harder to ignore. Alexander noticed that his life felt different whenever he was with Sophia and Ethan. The quiet moments that once seemed ordinary had become the moments he looked forward to most. A simple breakfast. A conversation at the kitchen table. Watching Ethan laugh about something small. These were things Alexander never expected to value so deeply. One afternoon, Alexander arrived at Sophia's home and found her looking through old photos with Ethan. The little boy was showing him pictures from school and explaining every detail. Alexander sat beside him, listening carefully. Sophia watched from across the room. She had seen many people act interested in Ethan because they wanted to impress her. Alexander was different. He was not trying. He simply cared. "You really enjoy spending time with him," Sophia said later while Ethan played in the other room. Alexander looked surprised by the comment. "Is that unusual?" She smiled slightly. "For someone like you?" "Maybe." He looked toward the hallway. "I did not expect it either." Sophia studied him. "What changed?" Alexander was quiet for a moment. "I think I forgot what it felt like to be around people who did not need anything from me." Sophia understood. Her life was the opposite of his. She had spent years needing help, but refusing to ask. He had spent years surrounded by people, but rarely felt truly known. Somehow, they met in the middle. That evening, Alexander attended a business dinner with important clients. Normally, he would have focused entirely on the conversation, the numbers, the negotiations, the opportunities. But his thoughts kept returning to something Ethan had said earlier. Families spend time together because they care. It was such a simple sentence, yet it stayed with him. After the dinner, Alexander received a message from Sophia. It was only a picture of Ethan holding a drawing. The drawing showed 3 people standing together. A mother, a child, and Alexander. Underneath, Ethan had written a few words. "My happy family." Alexander stared at the image for a long time. He knew it was only a child's imagination. He knew the agreement was not real, but the feeling it created was real. Meanwhile, Sophia was fighting her own emotions. She reminded herself every day that Alexander would eventually leave. The contract would end. His life would return to luxury and business. Hers would return to normal. But normal had started feeling different. Because Alexander had become part of their routine. Ethan looked for him. She found herself waiting for his messages. She noticed when he was tired. She cared when his day was difficult. Those were not the feelings she expected from a temporary arrangement. One evening, Sophia and Alexander talked after Ethan went to sleep. "Do you ever think about what happens when this ends?" Sophia asked. Alexander looked at her. He knew exactly what she meant. "Yes." And he looked down for a moment. "I do not know." The honesty surprised her. She expected confidence. She expected certainty. But Alexander was admitting that he did not have an answer. "That is not like you." Sophia said softly. He smiled. I know. For the first time, Alexander Reed was facing something he could not solve with logic. A company could be managed. A problem could be analyzed. A contract could have clear terms. But feelings did not follow instructions. The next day, Alexander had an important meeting with his executives. Everyone expected him to be focused on business. But during the discussion, he realized something about himself. He was no longer thinking only about his company's future. He was thinking about the kind of person he wanted to become. Sophia had shown him something he had forgotten. A meaningful life was not built only through achievements. It was built through connection. Later that evening, Alexander visited Sophia and Ethan. The moment he walked through the door, Ethan smiled. You came back. Alexander smiled. Yes, I did. It was a simple sentence. But both Sophia and Alexander felt the meaning behind it. Because somewhere between the first request and this moment, something had changed. Alexander was no longer just pretending to be part of their family. And Sophia was no longer sure she wanted him to leave when the pretending was over. The moment Alexander Reed realized he was no longer pretending was the moment he understood how much had changed. It was not a dramatic confession. It was not a perfect scene from a movie. It was something much quieter. A simple afternoon when Ethan asked him to stay a little longer, and Alexander found himself wanting to say yes. The agreement that brought them together had started as a solution to a problem. But now, it had become something neither Sophia Bennett nor Alexander knew how to define. Alexander still reminded himself of the rules. The arrangement had a purpose. It had an ending. But every time he looked at Sophia and Ethan, those rules felt less important. One evening, Sophia noticed Alexander looking at the contract papers on the table. You are thinking about the agreement, she said. Alexander looked up. Maybe. She sat across from him. We should remember why we started this. He nodded. I know. It was temporary. The words were simple, but they carried weight. Alexander understood what she was doing. She was protecting herself. Sophia had spent years learning not to depend on anyone. She had built a life around being strong because she had no other choice. The last thing she wanted was to believe in something that might disappear. Sophia, Alexander said quietly, do you think I would just leave without caring? She looked at him. I do not know. Her honesty surprised him. That is the problem. Alexander understood. Trust was not created by a few good moments. It was built over time. And he knew Sophia had reasons to be careful. The next day, Alexander invited Sophia and Ethan to a charity event connected to his company. It was supposed to be another appearance where they played their roles. But when they arrived, something felt different. Alexander introduced Sophia not as someone beside him for an event, but as someone important. He spoke about her opinions. He mentioned her strength. He made people see the person behind the circumstances. Sophia noticed. She had expected to be treated like part of a performance. Instead, Alexander made her feel respected. Later, during the event, Ethan became tired and sat quietly beside Alexander. Without hesitation, Alexander adjusted his schedule and stayed with him. Several people noticed the powerful CEO sitting on the floor beside a child, listening to a story about school and drawings. It was a simple image, but it showed a side of Alexander few people had ever seen. After the event, Sophia asked him about it. You did not have to stay with Ethan. Alexander smiled. I know. She looked at him. You keep saying that. He nodded. Because I want you to understand something. I am not doing these things because of the agreement anymore. Sophia became quiet. For a moment, the world around them seemed to slow down. She wanted to believe him, but she was afraid of what believing would mean. Alexander, she said softly, what happens when this ends? He looked at her. This time, he did not have a prepared answer. Because the truth was complicated. I do not know. Sophia looked surprised. A man like Alexander always seemed certain. But now he was admitting uncertainty. That is new for you, she said. He smiled slightly. Very. That night, Alexander returned home and realized something important. For years, he thought having control over everything was the reason for his success. But Sophia had shown him another way to live. A way where not every decision needed to be calculated. Some things mattered simply because they felt right. Meanwhile, Sophia watched Ethan sleep and thought about Alexander. She remembered the first day she asked him for help. She remembered how impossible it seemed that a billionaire CEO would understand her life. But now, Alexander knew Ethan's favorite stories. He knew how to make him laugh. He knew the small details that mattered. the things that could not be learned from a contract. The next morning, Ethan asked Sophia a simple question. Is Alexander coming today? She paused. I do not know. Ethan looked disappointed for only a moment. I hope he does. Sophia smiled gently. After he left the room, she sat quietly. Because the hardest part was no longer pretending Alexander belonged in their family. The hardest part was accepting that maybe, somehow, he already did. The moment Sophia Bennett feared most was not a difficult conversation or an uncomfortable question. It was the moment when the agreement with Alexander Reed started feeling real. Because if it became real, losing it would hurt. Sophia had built her entire life around protecting herself and Ethan. She knew how to handle disappointment. She knew how to keep moving forward. But Alexander had slowly become someone she trusted. And trust was something she could not easily take back. Alexander felt the same uncertainty. He had entered Sophia's life believing he was simply helping her. A temporary arrangement. A simple favor. But somewhere along the way, he stopped seeing Ethan as part of an agreement and started seeing him as a child he genuinely cared about. He stopped seeing Sophia as someone he was helping and started seeing her as someone who changed him. One evening, Alexander and Sophia attended another event together. They had done this many times now. They knew how to stand beside each other. They knew how to answer questions. They knew how to make people believe their story. But this time, something felt different. When Sophia laughed at one of Alexander's quiet jokes, the moment felt natural. When Alexander noticed she was tired and quietly made sure she had a chance to rest, it felt natural. Neither of them had to act anymore. After the event, they sat in the car outside Sophia's home. The city lights reflected against the windows. Neither person wanted to be the first to leave. This is getting complicated, Sophia finally said. Alexander looked at her. Because of the contract? She shook her head. Because of everything else. He understood. They were both talking about the same thing. The feelings they were trying not to name. Sophia, Alexander said quietly, I know what we agreed to. She looked at him. Then why does it feel different? He did not answer immediately. Because he knew the truth. It felt different because it was different. The next morning, Alexander had a meeting with his legal team regarding the arrangement. He reviewed the contract again. The ending date. The conditions. The agreement that was supposed to keep everything simple. But instead of feeling relieved, he felt something he did not expect. Loss. The idea of returning to a life without Sophia and Ethan felt empty. That realization surprised him. Alexander Reed had built a life where he rarely needed anyone. He was independent, controlled, successful. But now he had two people who made him want something he had never prioritized before. A home. Meanwhile, Sophia faced her own struggle. She knew Alexander had changed her life. She knew Ethan looked forward to seeing him. But she was afraid of depending on someone whose world was so different from hers. One evening, she found Alexander helping Ethan with a school project. The two of them sat on the floor surrounded by papers and colored pencils. Alexander, the billionaire CEO, was completely focused on a child's drawing. Sophia smiled without realizing it. This was the moment she knew the arrangement had changed. Because Alexander was no longer playing a role. He was becoming part of their lives. Later, after Ethan went to sleep, Sophia spoke honestly. I need to ask you something. Alexander looked at her. What? When this is over, what happens? He knew the question would come eventually. But hearing it still affected him. I do not know, he admitted. Sophia looked surprised. You do not know? Alexander shook his head. For the first time, I do not have a plan. That answer showed her something important. Alexander was not the untouchable CEO everyone believed him to be. He was a man trying to understand a feeling he could not control. That scares you, does it not? Sophia asked softly. He smiled slightly. More than any business decision I have ever made. They both laughed quietly. It was a small moment, but it felt honest. The next day, Ethan asked Alexander a question that stayed with him. Are you always going to be my friend? Alexander looked at the boy. He wanted to give the easy answer. But he knew life was not always simple. I hope so, he said. Ethan smiled. Good. That night, Alexander sat alone in his office. The city stretched below him. The same office. The same view. But he was not the same person. He had entered this arrangement thinking he was offering Sophia a temporary solution. He never expected her to show him what he had been missing. And Sophia had asked a billionaire to pretend to be her husband. She never expected him to become someone she could not imagine losing. The contract was still there. The rules were still written. But both of them knew something had changed. The biggest challenge was no longer pretending to be a family. It was facing the possibility that they had already become one. Alexander Reed had spent his entire life making decisions with confidence. He built a company from the ground up. He understood markets, negotiations, and risks. He knew how to protect his future through careful planning. But when it came to Sophia Bennett and Ethan, Alexander discovered something he could not control. His heart had already made a decision before his mind was ready to accept it. The arrangement that started as a simple agreement was now changing the way he saw everything. Alexander still had responsibilities as a CEO. He still had meetings, deadlines, and a company that depended on him. But his priorities were no longer the same. Before, he believed success meant reaching the highest position. Now, he wondered what success meant if there was no one to share it with. One morning, Alexander arrived at Sophia's home before they were scheduled to meet. He carried breakfast and a small gift for Ethan. Sophia opened the door and smiled in surprise. "You did not have to do that." Alexander looked at the bag in his hand. "I know." She noticed that answer had become familiar. He always knew he did not have to. He simply wanted to. Ethan ran toward him with excitement. "Alexander, look what I made." The little boy showed him a school project he had been working on. Alexander sat down and listened carefully as Ethan explained every detail. Sophia watched quietly from the kitchen. She remembered the first time Alexander entered their lives. A powerful CEO who seemed distant and unreachable. Now she saw a different person, a man who cared about the smallest things. Later that afternoon, Alexander and Sophia talked while Ethan played nearby. "You know this was never supposed to happen," Sophia said softly. Alexander looked at her. "What do you mean? You becoming part of our everyday life?" He understood, because he had thought the same thing. "I know." Sophia looked down. "I am afraid of what happens when the contract ends." Alexander became quiet. He knew she was not asking for reassurance. She was admitting a fear of losing something that had become important. "Sophia," he said gently, "I do not want you to think of this as something you have to lose." She looked at him. "Then what is it?" Alexander searched for the right words. For once, he did not have a perfect answer prepared. "I think it is something I do not want to walk away from." The honesty between them was powerful because it was unexpected. Alexander Reed was a man who always had control. But Sophia had become the one person who made him comfortable admitting uncertainty. That evening, Alexander attended a board meeting at Reed International. The discussion focused on future expansion and company growth. Normally, these conversations would have completely captured his attention. But something was different. When executives discussed sacrifices required for success, Alexander found himself questioning old beliefs. He thought about Sophia working late to provide for Ethan. He thought about Ethan asking if he would always be around. He thought about the kind of person he wanted to become. "Are you satisfied with the direction we are going?" one executive asked him. Alexander looked around the room. "I think we need to remember why we are building this company." Everyone waited for his answer. Success should create a better life. It should not replace one. The room became silent. It was not the kind of statement people expected from him. But Alexander meant every word. Meanwhile, Sophia struggled with her own emotions. She knew Alexander's world was different from hers. He belonged to a life of wealth, influence, and endless opportunities. She belonged to a quieter world built around Ethan and simple moments. But somehow, those two worlds had connected. That night, Ethan asked Sophia a question before going to sleep. "Is Alexander part of our family?" Sophia paused. The question was innocent, but it touched something deep inside her. "Why do you ask that?" Ethan smiled. "Because he cares about us." Sophia looked away, feeling the truth of those words. Children noticed what adults try to hide. They did not care about contracts or agreements. They cared about kindness. They cared about who stayed. Later, Alexander stood alone in his office looking at the city lights. The contract was still in place. The arrangement still had an ending. But he finally understood something. The most important things in life were not always the things you planned for. Sometimes they were the things that quietly became impossible to imagine losing. And somewhere along the way, a pretend husband had become someone who truly belonged. The closer Alexander Reed became to Sophia Bennett and Ethan, the more he understood that some decisions could not be measured by logic alone. For years, he had built his life around certainty. Every contract had terms. Every agreement had an ending. Every challenge had a solution. But his relationship with Sophia was becoming something that did not fit inside any plan. The contract was still there. The final date was still approaching. Yet the thought of returning to a life without them felt impossible. Alexander had never been afraid of losing a business opportunity. He had faced difficult negotiations, financial risks, and major challenges without hesitation. But the idea of losing the small moments with Ethan and Sophia created a feeling he could not ignore. One morning, Alexander arrived at Sophia's home and found Ethan preparing for a school presentation. The little boy was nervous because he had to speak in front of his class. Sophia was helping him practice, but Ethan kept looking down. Alexander sat beside him. "What are you presenting?" he asked. Ethan showed him his project. "I have to talk about my family." Alexander smiled gently. "That sounds important." Ethan nodded. "I want it to be good." Alexander looked at him. "You know what makes something special?" Ethan shook his head. "Being honest." The answer came naturally. But the moment he said it, Alexander realized he was talking about more than a school project. Honesty had become the foundation of everything changing in his own life. Later, Sophia watched Alexander encourage Ethan. She saw patience. She saw kindness. She saw someone who no longer felt like a visitor in their home. He belonged in those moments. That scared her, because belonging meant there was something to lose. That evening, Sophia and Alexander finally talked about the future. "The contract ends soon," Sophia said quietly. Alexander nodded. "I know." She looked at him. "What happens after that?" Alexander looked away for a moment. He had spent his entire life preparing answers. But this time, he needed honesty more than certainty. "I do not want things to go back to the way they were." Sophia's heart paused. "What do you mean?" He looked at her. "I mean, I do not want to walk away like none of this mattered." Sophia stayed silent. She wanted to believe him. But she also remembered how painful it was to hope for something that disappeared. "Alexander, you are going back to your world eventually." He shook his head. "Maybe my world has changed." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Alexander Reed, the man who once believed everything could be controlled, was admitting that Sophia and Ethan had changed him. Meanwhile, Alexander faced another challenge inside his company. Some executives questioned his recent decisions. They believed he was allowing personal feelings to influence his leadership. During the meeting, Alexander listened carefully. Then he responded calmly. "Understanding people is not a weakness." The room became quiet. A company is built by people. If we forget that, we lose the reason we exist. His words reflected the person he had become. Not a different man, a better version of himself. Later that day, Sophia received a message from Alexander. It was a simple picture of Ethan's school project after he finished it. Underneath was one sentence. "He did great." Sophia smiled. It was such a small thing. But those small things were exactly what made Alexander different. He noticed. He cared. He stayed. That evening, Ethan asked Sophia something unexpected. "Mom, when Alexander leaves, will he still visit?" Sophia looked at her son. She did not know how to answer, because she had been asking herself the same question. The truth was, Alexander was no longer just someone helping them. He had become part of their everyday life. He had become someone they looked for, someone they trusted, someone they missed when he was gone. Across the city, Alexander stood in his office looking at the contract that started everything. He remembered the first day Sophia asked him for help. A simple request, a temporary arrangement, a situation he thought he understood. But he was different now. The contract had an ending. The feelings did not. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Reed realized the most important things were not the things he could control. They were the things he was brave enough to keep. The day Alexander Reed and Sophia Bennett had been trying not to think about finally arrived. The contract that brought them together had reached its final days. The agreement that once felt like a simple solution now felt like something much harder to leave behind. Alexander looked at the document on his desk, remembering the first time Sophia walked into his office. She had been nervous. She had been desperate. But she had also been one of the strongest people he had ever met. At that time, he thought he was helping her. Now he understood that Sophia had given him something far more valuable. She had shown him a life beyond success. A life filled with connection, warmth, and purpose. Across the city, Sophia prepared herself for the conversation she knew was coming. She told herself she would be grateful. She told herself she would accept whatever happened next. But when she looked around her home, she realized how much had changed. Ethan had grown comfortable with Alexander being there. He looked forward to his visits. He trusted him. And somewhere along the way, Sophia had started doing the same. That evening, Alexander arrived at her home. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They both knew why he was there. "The contract ends tomorrow," Sophia finally said. Alexander nodded. "I know." The silence between them felt heavier than before. "I guess this is where we say goodbye," she whispered. Alexander looked at her. "Is that what you want?" The question surprised her. "What do you mean?" He stepped closer. "I thought we were supposed to decide together." Sophia looked away. "Alexander, your life is different from mine. You have a company, responsibilities, a world I do not belong to." He shook his head. "You keep saying that." "Because it is true." Alexander looked at her carefully. "No. What is true is that you are the first person who made me question whether I was living the right life." Sophia became quiet. She had expected many things from this moment. She expected a polite goodbye. She expected Alexander to return to his world. She did not expect him to admit that she had changed him. "I cannot promise that everything will be easy," Alexander continued. "I cannot promise that I know exactly what happens next." He paused. "But I know I do not want to pretend anymore." Sophia looked at him. Those words carried everything they had avoided saying. The pretending was over. The feelings were real. But before she could answer, Ethan walked into the room holding his favorite drawing. "Alexander, look." They both turned. Ethan held up the picture proudly. It showed the same three people he had drawn before. Sophia, Ethan, Alexander. "I made it better," Ethan said. Alexander smiled. "You did?" Ethan nodded. "Because families should stay together." The simple sentence touched both adults. Sophia looked at Alexander. For a moment, all the complicated thoughts disappeared. There was only the truth. Alexander had become someone Ethan trusted. Someone Sophia trusted. Someone who had quietly become part of their lives. Later that night, Alexander sat with Sophia and Ethan while they talked about the future. There were no contracts, no rules, no pretending, just honesty. "I do not want to be here because of an agreement," Alexander said. "I want to be here because this is where I want to be." Sophia felt tears forming, but she smiled. "You know this is not going to be perfect." Alexander nodded. "I know. There will be difficult days. I know. And you cannot solve everything with money." He smiled. "I learned that already." They both laughed softly. It was a simple moment, but it was the kind of moment they once thought they could never have. The next morning, Alexander officially ended the arrangement. Not because he wanted to leave, because he no longer wanted their relationship to exist because of a contract. He wanted it to exist because of a choice. His choice. Their choice. Months earlier, Alexander Reed agreed to pretend to be Sophia Bennett's husband for one evening. He thought he was helping a single mother through a difficult situation. He never expected that the role he was pretending to play would become the life he truly wanted. And Sophia never expected that the man who entered her life as a temporary solution would become the person who reminded her that she did not have to carry everything alone. Sometimes, the people who enter our lives by accident become the ones who help us find exactly where we belong. Months after the night when a simple agreement changed everything, Alexander Reed looked at his life and realized he had become someone he never expected to be. He was still the CEO of Reed International. He was still the man whose decisions influenced a major company. But the most important part of his life was no longer found inside an office or written in a business report. It was found in the small moments he shared with Sophia Bennett and Ethan. The morning routines, the conversations at the dinner table, the laughter that filled a home that once belonged only to a mother and her son. Alexander had entered their lives pretending to be a husband. But somewhere along the way, he became something much more meaningful. He became someone they trusted, someone they loved. Sophia noticed the difference every day. Alexander no longer acted like someone visiting their world. He was part of it. He knew Ethan's favorite stories. He remembered small details. He showed up when it mattered. And most importantly, he never made Sophia feel like she needed to earn his kindness. One evening, Sophia and Alexander sat together watching Ethan finish a school project. The room was quiet and peaceful, a feeling Sophia once thought she would never have again. "Do you ever think about how strange all of this is?" Sophia asked. Alexander smiled. "All the time." She looked at him. "You walked into my office as a stranger." He nodded. "And you asked me to pretend to be your husband." They both laughed softly. "I never expected this," Sophia admitted. Alexander looked toward Ethan. Neither did I. There was a quiet understanding between them. They both knew their story had not started in the usual way. There was no perfect first meeting, no carefully planned future. It started with a desperate request and a temporary agreement. But sometimes the most unexpected beginnings create the strongest connections. Later that week, Alexander took Ethan to a small community event. People recognized him immediately. The billionaire CEO, the powerful businessman, the person everyone expected to see surrounded by executives and luxury. But that day, people saw something different. They saw him helping Ethan with a simple activity. They saw him laughing. They saw a man who looked happier than he ever appeared in business magazines. Sophia watched from a distance and smiled. She remembered the first time she met him. She remembered how impossible it seemed that someone like Alexander could understand her life. But he had proven something important. People were not always defined by where they came from. They were defined by the choices they made. That evening, Alexander returned home and found a small envelope on the table. Inside was the original contract from their agreement. Sophia had kept it as a reminder of where everything began. Alexander looked at the document and smiled. "Do you still have this?" Sophia nodded. "I thought it was important." He looked at her. "Why?" She touched the paper gently. "Because it reminds me that something that started as pretend became something real." Alexander looked at the contract one last time. Then he placed it away. Not because the past did not matter, but because they no longer needed a piece of paper to define what they had become. Ethan walked into the room holding his drawing again. The same drawing that started everything. 3 people standing together. This time, he added something new. A small house. Alexander looked at it and smiled. "You added a house." Ethan nodded. "Because families need a home." Sophia looked at Alexander. Neither of them needed to say anything. They understood. Home was never about a building. It was about the people who made you feel safe. Years earlier, Alexander believed his greatest achievement was building a successful company. Sophia believed her greatest strength was handling everything alone. But they both learned the same lesson. The most valuable things in life are not always the things we chase. Sometimes they are the things that quietly find us. Alexander Reed once agreed to pretend to be a husband for one night. He never expected that the role would lead him to the family he had always wanted. Sophia Bennett once asked a stranger for help. She never expected that stranger would become the person who reminded her she never had to carry everything alone. And in the end, the story was never about pretending. It was about discovering that sometimes the most unexpected person becomes the one who truly belongs.